Welcome back to the C# for Total Noobs training course on developer ramp-up. In this video we'll play around with variables. We will see exactly how we can declare variables and how we can initialize them. And finally we'll also see how we can use variables in our console application. To do that we will also need to talk a little bit about data types, because data types are really important in conjunction with variables. We won't go very deep into details, but kind of some basic things about data types that we would have to know right now at this stage on our journey to become a software developer. Before we really get going, I would like to do another thing in Visual Studio so that you can get acquainted also with the IDE. Here we have a color scheme that is very light. So we have a lot of white, and this is maybe not optimal for the eyes. So what I would like to do is to change it to a dark theme. And to do that, we can simply go and click on Tools, then Options, where we should have a General tab, and here we can choose a color scheme. So instead of blue or light or anything else, I will go with dark. This should then change the color scheme of my Visual Studio IDE to dark, which is optimal for the eyes, or at least for my eyes. Of course, all the functionality of Visual Studio 2017 stays the same, only that what we would have is the black background. And that's it, we have it right now. The next step, of course, we should get really started with our application, so let's open the application where we left it last time. And if you launch Visual Studio, you should see here in the recent list the application that we have worked on last time. So we just click it, and Visual Studio will load our project. Since this is not a very large project, this won't take very long. And indeed, after a few seconds, this is our project. We have this hello world that we have written last time, and we have added this console read line to make sure that this console stays open after hello world is displayed. Because initially, we have seen that right after this message was displayed, the console was basically closed and we couldn't see the outcome of it. So this console read line is here very important. Let's dive directly into it and let's declare and initialize a new variable. So let's do it string hello equals, and here let's put hello world once again. Now what we have done here is basically we have declared and initialized a variable which is called hello. Now in console write line, instead of writing hello world, let's just add this variable. And what this would do, normally it should display the exact same message, only that in this case we do not hard code hello world in console write line, but we use a string variable instead. Let's run the application and see if it brings up the result that we expect. It shouldn't take long. Indeed, we see now that we have here hello world on the screen, and the console stays open until we close it or until we press enter. So that's it. We have declared and initialized a variable. Now in this process of declaring and initializing a variable, we have four major components or parts. The first one is string, and this is a data type. We can see that it's also a keyword, so it is highlighted in blue by Visual Studio. Then we have hello, which is the name of our variable. We have the equal operator, which assigns a value to this variable called hello, and the value is of course hello world. So let's explain a little bit deeper what each part of this expression does. So first of all, string. String, as said, is a data type, and data types are really important for C#. This is the reason why we have to pause a little bit our coding and to try to explain how data types work in C#. In order to do that, I will try to make a very simple analogy to some fruits. So let's get started with it. Let's assume that we have one apple. And if we think about the storage space that we would need in order to store this apple somewhere, I would express it like this. So this would be the storage needed to store this apple somewhere in our warehouse. Now, if we think that we have also a pineapple, we know for sure that pineapples should be bigger than apples. So if we think about the amount of storage that we would need to store this pineapple, it would be slightly bigger than the one needed for an apple. I think that's fairly straightforward. Let's go, however, one step further and let's imagine we also have a watermelon. Of course, we know once again that watermelons are bigger than pineapples and of course bigger than apples. So the storage space that we would need in order to store this watermelon would be bigger than the one that we needed for a pineapple or for an apple. And if we put all these fruits together, we would have a certain amount of storage needed to store them. And of course the watermelon would take a lot of our storage, a pineapple would take of course less, and an apple, I think it would take the least amount of storage. And if we think about all this together, this is the space needed to store one watermelon, one pineapple, and one apple somewhere in our warehouse. This might sound strange to you, but exactly this is the whole concept for data types. This is, of course, a certain type of oversimplification, but this is really the main concept how data types works. Because when we declare a data type and we say it is a string, what we basically do is we instruct the computer that we would use a variable that takes a certain amount of space. So a string would take a certain amount of space. If we would use an integer, which is another data type in C#, that would mean that we instruct the computer that this variable needs only the space needed for a certain integer. Should it be bigger or smaller than the string, this is none of our concern. So this is handled by .NET. But the entire idea is that we need to instruct .NET what type of data we want to have, because according to the type that we define, the .NET will then, let's say, put together or make or reserve a certain amount of space in memory for that certain variable. So let's switch back to Visual Studio now. Previously we have already worked with strings. So string is a data type that instructs .NET or the computer or the program or the compiler to set aside or to reserve a certain amount of space needed for this certain string variable. Strings are used in C# in order to hold values that are text. So we can write hello world, or we can add here whichever text we would like to add. It doesn't matter how long it is or how short, we just need to write text. And the important thing is that when we declare strings, we initialize, and where we put the value, we always need to do this in quotation marks. Good, after string, we have this hello. Hello is just the name of the variable. And this is the way how we can use the variable anywhere in our program further, just by using the name that we have defined previously. Now, there is really no restriction on how you would like to name your variables. Of course, there are certain keywords in C#, like for instance string and many others that you cannot use as a name for your variable. But except those keywords, you can use whatever you want here. Let's go now one step further and see what this equal does. This equal just assigns a value to this variable that is called hello. So without this equal, we couldn't assign this text to this variable. This is why this equal sign is really very important. And last but not least, we have the value of the variable itself. And putting all these four parts together, the data type, the name of the variable, the equal operator, and the value, which in this case is in quotation marks because it is a text, we declare and initialize a variable. Going a little bit back to data types, here we used already a string. Let's go to a numeric type, which is int, which stands for integer. And let's call it number and equal 5 or 6 in this case. So what we have done here is exactly the same thing that we have done previously. So we have declared the data type, which is an integer, which instructs .NET how much space in memory should it reserve for this variable. Then we have the name, in this case we called it number. Then we have the equal operator, which assigns a value, and in this case the value is 6. Since this is an integer, not a string, we don't have to use quotation marks. So this is a difference. When you define strings, you need to use quotation marks. When you don't do that, then if you just define a string or you want to initialize a string, you don't have to use these quotation marks. Now I have this green line under number because I have declared and initialized this variable, but I have never used it into my program. So let's avoid this by simply doing another console write line just below, and in that case let's print number. This should then print our number. Thing to notice here that string is a data type that we use when we want to have variables that contain text as value. Int, for instance, is a data type that we would use when we would like to use numbers. And in this case, we only use natural numbers. So when we use integers, we cannot declare floating point numbers. So we couldn't say 6.1 or something like that. So integer is only used for whole numbers. It could be positive or negative, it doesn't play any role. It is important that is really a whole number. Then we have another data type that we could use, for instance, when we want to use also floating point numbers. And one of these data types is called a double. Now let's call it double number 2 equals, and since this is a double, we can do it also, we can use also decimal, so floating points. So let's do 7.1 and semicolon at the end, of course, as we already know. In this case, we have declared a variable of type double, we have named it number 2, we have used this equal operator and assigned the value of 7.1. So let's add another console write line. And here we would like to print the number 2. This should do it. So we have strings, that is a data type we have to use when we use text. We have integer, that is a data type that we can use when we use whole numbers, positive or negative, but without any floating points. And we have these doubles that we can use when we want to have also floating point numbers. Then we have also some other types. And let's start with bool. Bool, let's name it is true. And let's make it true, like the name also says. So what this means, the Boolean data type basically holds only two possible values, which is true or false. And throughout your career of software developer, you will work with a lot of bools, because this is really the basis for all logic that we can apply to different algorithms. So bool is really very important, and it can be only true or only false. There are a lot of other data types, but we won't go deeper into them right now. However, there is one more thing that I would like to add here, and these are the arrays. Arrays are basically a list of some types. And let's try to see how we declare and initialize an array. We won't dive deep into arrays right now because we will have a dedicated video about arrays. But if we want to declare an array of integers, we have to do it like this. Int, then numbers, and then we have to initialize it, and we have to use these brackets. And here, of course, we can simply say 1, 2, 4. So these are the elements that we have put in this array. What is really important here is how we have declared this, because we have used this type of parentheses. So this is really important because this means that what we will have right now is an array of integers. So this is the data type, then the way that we instruct that we want to have an array, so a list, then the name, once again the equal operator, and when we initialize the value, we will declare it like this in brackets, and then also the values separated by comma. Arrays, as said, are really important, and we will dive deeper into arrays when we will talk about collections and lists and so on. For now, I just wanted you to make aware that this is the way we declare an array. And in fact, we already can see in our program that we have already used arrays, or the program has by default used an array of strings, because what we have in the static void main is an array of strings that is called args. So this means that when the program is run, what happens is that a string array that is called args is passed to this program. Important here to note is only that we have used here an array of strings. Good. So that's it for the most common data types that you will use in C#. And you have seen here how you can declare them and initialize them. One other thing that needs to be said is that we can simply declare a variable, int number 5. And that's it. So we have declared the variable, but we have not initialized it to any value. So in this case, we just have this variable available, but in order to work with it, we have at a certain point in our code to give to a value to this integer. And we can do this very simply. For instance, number 5 equals, let's name it 5, and that's it. So we have on one line of code declared the variable of type integer and with the name number 5, but we have initialized it with a value only in the next line of code, where we have just written the name of this variable number 5, and we have used this equal operator and assigned to it the value of 5. Important here to notice that when you declare a variable, it's not necessarily to also initialize the variable at the same place. And this might be a very important information, because one other thing that we would have to take into consideration when talking about variables is variable scope. Variables are only accessible within a certain scope. And what does this mean? It means that they are available only within the code block where they are declared, or in, let's say, child code blocks. So if we would have another code block here below, for instance here, and this would be the case, for instance, when we have for loops or if statements and so on, we'll look at this type of statements and loops in other videos. But for now, we can only imagine that inside this code block, there is another code block. And in that child code block, if we want to use number 5, we can do that. But for instance, if we want to use number 5 in this class code block, here a very brief thing, we cannot declare variable directly into classes. We will see exactly why, and we will see exactly what we can have in some classes. But let's only assume that we would have declared in this code block a certain variable, then this means that that variable would be also available for this code block. But on the contrary, the variable that we have declared here and also initialized here wouldn't be available in this code block, in this superior code block. So this is what we call variable scope. They are accessible only within the code block or where they have been defined, or in child code blocks, but not in parent code blocks like this one here. And this is really important. And in fact, this is why we would like to at some points declare the variables but not initialize them to any value, because we would have another code blocks, for instance an if statement, and in that if statement we would then assign this value 5 to this number 5 variable. And of course, if we would have a console write line number 5 afterward, it would display 5. And we'll look at this one more time when we'll talk about these if statements. For now, it's really important to note that what we have here are variables that are only available within the code block where they have been declared, or in the subsequent child code blocks. But they are not available in the parent code block in comparison to the code block where they have been defined. So that's mostly it regarding variables. We have seen how we can declare a variable and initialize it to a certain value. We have seen what variable types we have in C#. We mentioned that there are a lot of other types that we can have, and we can have also our custom types. We can have real classes that act as a variable. We'll see all this later in this training course. For now, I think it's important if you try to memorize this type of data types that we use, because we use them really often. So it's string for text, it's integer or int for numbers, for whole numbers, positive or negative, it's double when we want to have decimal numbers, it's bool from boolean when we want to work with true or false. And all these variables are available in a certain scope. This means in the code block where they have been declared and in the subsequent child code blocks. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll already go into the if statements, and we can see how we can make some decisions based on some inputs that we might have received from the console. With this occasion, we'll also learn how to pass values from the console. So we will do a program that will basically ask the user that runs this program to provide a certain value or a certain input, and we will work with that input then in our program. So don't miss our next video and stay tuned.